When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright guys, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be doing part 3 of my Dance with Dragons retrospective. And I took a bit of a break from this series. I had the first 2 parts up pretty quickly, actually, back in, I think, about April, May-ish. And I took a break. I think I just felt overloaded from doing Feast for Crows, pretty much all the way back to back, getting that done pretty quickly, doing my actual reread and finishing up a Game of Thrones. I will say, if you want to actually see this full series, since it has been a while since I've uploaded it, I would go back to part 2 and part 1. But, yeah, so we're going to get back into A Dance with Dragons. And part of the reason that I think that I kind of took a break from this is we're starting to get towards, like, the middle of the actual story. And to me, the main issue I have of this book really becomes apparent. I think the quality in chapter to chapter is on just complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And that's going to start with our first chapter of today's retrospective as we go through about 14 or 15 chapters in today's video. The 28th chapter of Dance with Dragons being Tyrion VII. And so before we get into this specific chapter, I want to talk about Tyrion specifically in terms of the rest of the book. Tyrion still has a lot of chapters left. Even in this only like 14, 15 chapter part of the book that we're going to be covering, which is more the middle to then a little after the middle, he has 3 chapters in here, and I don't think any of his chapters are particularly good after he leaves the Young Griff section of his story. So the first half of his story, I thought he was enjoyable. I think he was really good in some chapters, just kind of okay in others. Pretty much every chapter, the rest of the book, for me with Tyrion, I don't have a lot of positives to say about the character. I don't enjoy really much of what's going on in his chapters or even who he's with, and that's, I think, part of the problem to me is Tyrion's journey is basically now the same as Quentyn's. It's, I have to get to Daenerys, how do we get to Daenerys, and all of that. Now, for Tyrion, I will say he's a more interesting character than Quentyn, so that helps his case quite a lot, because I still have Tyrion's chapters so far above Quentyn's. But if you even look at this chapter, so Tyrion VII is our first chapter post the Young Griff storyline, and it is not a good one. I think Tyrion VII is probably one of the worst chapters of this book, because all that happens is it's Tyrion and Jorah, and the two are not very interesting to read with each other because Jorah does not really talk to Tyrion at all, just kind of like lugs him around, wants him to shut up a bunch, and this isn't the Jorah of the show. I think that needs to be made very apparent. Ian Glenn, who played the character of Jorah in the show, was much more likable. Jorah in the books, in my opinion, is not the most likable character given what he does and how kind of weird he is towards Daenerys and kind of the things that he does in specifically, I would say, book 3. He's not the most likable character. And so you pair him up with Tyrion, where Tyrion is kind of on this journey of self-discovery and what comes after King's Landing and his family and being in exile. And so you pair the two up together, and they're not the most interesting duo whatsoever because Tyrion has nobody really to play off of, right? It's him almost talking to a brick wall. So that part of the chapter is not very interesting. And so then the other part of the chapter is trying to figure out how do we get some sort of passage for Tyrion to get to Daenerys. It's the same idea as of Quentyn, right? It's basically just taking what that chapter was and just recycling it here with Tyrion. And so Tyrion and Jorah end up going to see the Widow of the Waterfront after they spend the night in an inn. And basically, at first, it's like she doesn't seem like she's going to give them passage, and she's questioning Jorah's motives to go to see Daenerys and all this stuff. And she kind of basically turns them down until Penny attacks Tyrion. And then she's like, okay, well, you guys can, go there, as the boat is suspected not to reach its destination. It's just a really weird, awkward way of them getting transportation. The Penny attack, I guess, is the most interesting part of this chapter because it is adding another level to the Purple Wedding, being that Penny was one of the people in the actual joust that started almost the whole conflict that Littlefinger bought so that it would pretty much put Tyrion and Joffrey at odds during the wedding to frame him. It's interesting that layer comes about in this book, but I don't, and this is specifically going to look at the next couple of chapters. I don't particularly enjoy the characters of Penny and Tyrion together. Again, it's putting Tyrion with a bunch of people that are not really that witty. They're not really playing off of Tyrion's best parts, and that's, his political mind and things like that. it's putting him in this other element that I just don't really find that enjoyable. And so the chapter kind of ends with them getting passage. But as of right now, I have this as a bottom 3 chapter of the book so far, even with the chapters we're going to do in today's video. And even as I'm a little bit further in my retrospective in terms of actually reading chapters, I just didn't want to make it as long in this video. But even going further, this is still, in my opinion, the worst chapter outside of Quentyn chapters. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Tyrion VII. So let's kind of move on to maybe some better chapters. Now, getting into chapter 29, we have Jon VI. Now, unfortunately, once again, I don't really think this is the strongest chapter for Jon. I just think it's a, fine middle of the book kind of chapter. It's not anything crazy. We're still post Stannis being at the Wall, so a lot of the, I would say, more interesting parts of the Wall, which Jon has been a very consistent and good POV so far of this book, and will continue to be one. This is definitely just another building block chapter. It doesn't really have any real massive reveals. It doesn't really forward the plot a ton. It's just kind of one of those middle chapters. So this chapter with Jon and Jon VI is focused on about 2 or 3 things, really. So the first thing that you have happening in the chapter is Jon is sending out 3 rangings, one with Alliser Thorne included in it. And this could be seen as a very good play by Jon, even though this isn't what it is meant to do, is that you're ridding yourself of a big threat to your power. Alliser Thorne being basically Jon's biggest rival outside of maybe Janos Slynt, who is already dead in this book. And so you can see it from that point of view. It's actually a good political move to do so, because it's kind of a win-win situation. On one hand, if he does die, well, oh well. He's somebody that was somebody that was not a big fan of you and would have been probably plotting your demise. But if he does come back, well, all the better, right? He comes back with successful ranging, finding out whatever information, and Alliser Thorne is a good warrior. And in that sense, it makes a lot of sense for Jon to send Alliser Thorne, but that's not really what Jon was intending. But Thorne has to go regardless. He realizes, he can't deny this order. If he denies an order, he's going to end up like Slynt. The next part of this chapter kind of follows Jon doing some training, as he first starts with sparring with 3 new recruits. It's him just beating up on them. Kind of reminds me of Jon's first chapter at the Wall in a Game of Thrones, where he's just vastly better than everybody, here in these recruits specifically, and kind of plays out the same, except Jon is doing a 3-on-1 and basically takes them out pretty easily. But then you have Rattleshirt, who we know is Mance, but is pretending to be Rattleshirt. He has not been revealed yet, but he will very soon. Rattleshirt, or Mance, actually challenges Jon to a fight. Now, the fight is interesting because Jon doesn't actually fight with Longclaw here. So it's quite a different fight if these two would be fighting to the death if they'd actually met in the field, because Jon would have Longclaw. And I do think that makes the difference, because Mance does end up getting the better of Jon. And the fight itself is kind of interesting, because some people kind of speculate that this is Arthur Dayne. I don't think so, but I think it is interesting. That's what really sparks this debate, is kind of this fight, and then also some of the songs that Mance seems to sing. But yeah, I mean, it's a fight. It doesn't really have much consequence to it. It's not really that important in my opinion, but it is some action and passes the time in this chapter a little bit. After this point, Jon gets a letter saying Arya will marry Ramsay, and he thinks on kind of their time together when they were, young in book 1. And that leads him to taking a walk. He's dealing with a lot of issues right now. He's dealing with, what does he do about Arya, somebody that he deeply cares about, marrying this Ramsay person that doesn't have a good reputation. Then you also have issues with the wildlings and the Night's Watch and other issues going on, and he just seems overwhelmed. And it even seems to get to him because he seems like he spots Ygritte. He sees this woman in front of him, and it looks like Ygritte, but it's actually Mel. And it's Mel kind of, I would assume, doing tricks on Jon's mind to basically show that she has power, right? Mel is very clearly trying to get on Jon's good side, but she tells him a couple things. The first thing she tells him is that she has seen 3 of the men coming back eyeless, as well as Arya on a dying horse fleeing her marriage. Now, not much truly happens here, because it's really just George setting the table for things to come later, right? So, for instance, in the Mel chapter we're going to get, those things are going to be important to understanding Jon's plotline and going forward, because it has to be established. Jon is not going to automatically just trust Melisandre because she spouts some visions. He's going to need proof that her magic actually works in her visions. Kind of the same idea with Stannis. And so those things will happen a little bit later. this chapter really is just setting up Jon and Mel's relationship going forward and what they're going to be kind of doing, and how, Mel will use Mance and all that stuff. It's very much a setup chapter. Doesn't have a terrible amount of substance to it, to be honest. It's just kind of a mid chapter for Jon. But saying that, right, it's not a bad chapter of this book, right? I like this chapter significantly more than, say, like Tyrion or Quentyn chapters. It's just, for the Jon storyline, it's probably one of the weaker ones of the first kind of 6 for him. You might be thinking, we're starting this video, we've had 2 chapters that I'm not too thrilled with, especially the first one. The second one's fine, but, not any bangers. But then George comes back swinging, and I've always said this throughout my Feast for Crows retrospective and this retrospective. George has to know what his weakest chapters are going to be, or at least perceives which ones are not going to be received as well. Because think about those 2 chapters, right? One of the worst chapters in the story, and it comes between an Asha chapter, which I think is one of the best of the early section of the story, and then it comes between the best chapter, in my opinion, of the book. Now, there is also a Jon chapter in there, but I think these 2 chapters are going to hide those. Because we get, at number 30, Davos IV. And I've talked about this. I even just made a video talking about this chapter a little bit, because for me, at least, early on in this retrospective, we're going to be, by the end of this video, about 41 chapters into the book of the possible 73. And this is my favorite chapter of the book, I'm pretty sure, but we'll see if that changes by the time I get done with this series. But Davos IV is the North Remembers chapter, and I love this chapter so much because it parallels, actually, Ned's last chapter in A Game of Thrones. If you guys remember with Ned's last chapter in A Game of Thrones, it's kind of all about, him thinking about his life and the choices that he's made to, getting here, and the possibility of him dying soon or whatever, right? Now, it's a little different in terms of the ending, right? Because Ned, his whole plot line is about, will he give up his honor and all these things to protect his family? Davos's isn't like that, because Davos is in a better situation than Ned is. But you still see those same things kind of playing out with Davos' chapter, right? The beginning of this chapter opens with kind of his situation, right? His connection with the guards, and learning the history of the Manderleys, and also this jail cell that he is in, the Wolf's Den, which has a very lengthy history and is insanely awesome to learn about in this chapter. And we even get a little bit more about how Davos seems to be being treated well, right? If you think about Davos 3, Wyon Manderley publicly wanted Davos' head, right? So why is Davos being able to have simple requests being filled out? Things for parchment, to be able to write, to be able to read. He's getting a lot of luxuries that he wasn't even getting when he was a prisoner of Stannis' in A Storm of Swords. Davos is treated quite well. And so there's a little bit of this unease building in you, the reader, and Davos. Why has he lived this long? Why is he being treated kind of okay? It's a little weird, until all of a sudden, during the night, Robert Glover comes to Davos in the middle of the night, asking for him to follow him. And obviously Davos is going to be very wary of this, right? Is this the time when Davos dies? What is truly happening here? And as the tension kind of builds, Davos is introduced once again to Wyman Manderley. And you have this whole huge reveal that ends up actually changing the northern politics completely, because we learn here that Wyon Manderley is playing the phrase for fools, right? He's trying to act, but he can't, because his son is being held captive. And so Wyon Manderley is playing almost 3D chess, right? He's trying to make some moves to get the phrase out of power and the Boltons out of power, but he needs some certain things from Davos. And we learn about Wex, a character that mysteriously kind of disappears in A Clash of Kings with Theon. But we never see him again, right? Theon doesn't really think of Wex, none of those things. But Wex pops out here as Wyon Manderley and Robert Glover have found him. And they reveal that Bran and Rickon seem to be alive. And specifically, they know where Rickon is. He's in Skagos. And that leads Davos to then go to Skagos, but it's so great because this chapter is so perfect for the reader. Because not only is it a huge reveal to Davos, but we're kind of in this dark period where the Starks have been scattered, right? And none of them are really trying to get power, right? If you think about Arya, she's learning. Sansa's in a learning position. All of our Stark characters are kind of growing at this point, but none of them are looking to reclaim the North. It's only Stannis. And so when you have the Manderleys have this idea that, yeah, we'll back Stannis if you get, Rickon, it introduces another element into this chapter that's interesting. And the one thing I also find that's interesting about the set of chapters we're doing in this, set, in this retrospective, in this part of the video, there's a lot of different plot lines that just end, right? That's one thing I find very weird about Dance with Dragons is there's a lot of plot lines that even like halfway into the book, they just end. Like for instance, this is our last Davos chapter until Winds of Winter. Whenever we get Winds of Winter, it will pick up after this chapter. There is no chapter in this book after this. And, others that I'm going to talk about in this video, for instance, Mel only has one chapter. She does not appear until probably Winds of Winter. If you think about Areo Hotah, he has a book. He has a chapter in this book. And we won't see him again until Winds of Winter. Bran, he only has 3 chapters in this book, but this will be the last chapter that he has until Winds of Winter. So you see a lot of the plots kind of ending quite early on in this book, which I find really fascinating, and I wonder why George did it that way. Now, part of it is the timing of events. Maybe you want a passage of time to occur before we go back to Davos, right, of him sailing to Skagos, and then maybe in the next book we pick up on him actually being in Skagos. Who knows? Number 31, we have Dany V. So, again, what I've talked about with Daenerys pretty much throughout the early portion of this book is she's just a POV that's pretty okay, right? She's not good, but she's not terribly bad, but she's not really good either. She's kind of stuck somewhere in the middle where none of her chapters really feel bad, but none of them are like the best chapters of the book, right? So like even if you look at my ratings, which I'll talk about by the end of this book, a lot of Daenerys' chapters are just in the middle. So that's kind of how I feel about this chapter as well. Because Dany in Dany 5 really feels that the trap is tightening on Meereen. They are being blockaded but have no navy to combat it, and Daenerys refuses to use her dragons. She's completely lost control of her dragons. Brown Ben Plum is someone that keeps pushing for that. When Daenerys doesn't listen to him, those have repercussions. That we'll see the repercussions in the following chapters because Daenerys is not using her true power, the dragons. When she gets her army and she starts becoming a conqueror, it's because of her dragons, right? Her dragons allow her to get the Unsullied, but now she has no control of them, and that is really screwing her up because that's her advantage. But outside of that going on, we also see a lot of suspicious activity going on. Dany has had Hizdahr followed just to see what he's up to, and we know from the reports that he has visited all the families at the pyramids, and the killings have stopped. So how is it that Hizdahr is able to basically quench any of these killings going on where Daenerys can't? Because it makes it feel like Hizdahr has to have some connection to the Sons of the Harpy, or at least know of the people that are in charge of them. And so if that is the case, Hizdahr comes off as very suspicious. Is Hizdahr part of the Sons of the Harpy, like many of the characters in Daenerys' council believes, or is he actually just a puppet figure for the Sons of the Harpy? Like they're using him to get what they want. So for instance, if you are somebody that is in the Sons of the Harpy, if you're the Green Grace, let's say she's the head of the Sons of the Harpy, which is what I believe, you're going to want Hizdahr to become king because you want some sort of representation of the customs and the things that the Meereenese people, want, right? Dany is very progressive. She doesn't listen to the cultures a lot of the times of Meereen. And so you're putting Hizdahr on the throne. And so the only way to do that is to stop the killings, right? So once those killings start, you can now have that influence through Hizdahr. And then after that point, if Daenerys was to say die, well, Hizdahr has already been declared as the king. And so you can rule through him. And so that even comes down to later on when we see the poison, locusts. Those probably were meant to kill Daenerys. And if that was the case, Hizdahr would have become the king. There's a lot of that going on right now. There's a lot of suspicious politics going on, building up for the kind of the last stretch of the book. But we also find out about what is going on at Astapor, right? And we saw with the last chapter of Quentyn what was going on there. But one of the reasons I don't think that chapter is even necessary is because Daenerys hears all of it in the next coming chapters. And so it feels like that was kind of a waste of time. It didn't really establish anything. And even when you think about that Quentyn is given to get to Daenerys, that's also kind of basically described to Daenerys by Daario. It's just not very needed, but here she finds out what is going on, how there's a bunch of refugees coming to Meereen, that Astapor was basically sacked and many people died and were killed, and just the horrors of the sack of Astapor. But these refugees, who Daenerys feels very bad for, of course, these are her people, they are carrying a disease. And that is the first issue that Dany has to deal with. It'll become more apparent in the next chapter, but what is Daenerys supposed to do? She's helpless. She can't face the Yunkai in open battle, because if she does so, she has to rely on the brazen beasts to keep the city. And who's to say they don't just close the gates and start ruling over Meereen? She can't trust them. And so it's Daenerys being backed into a corner. She can't break the blockade without her dragons. She can't meet the Yunkai who are coming to Meereen in open battle. And she also can't even help these refugees at all. She doesn't have enough food to even support Meereen. If you open your gates to these refugees, that whole disease is just going to carry throughout the city, and then bam, you're going to be, not only are you going to be starving because you don't have enough food, but you're also going to have people that are going to be sick and ill. And that's when the people turn against you. And so Daenerys is kind of forced into an action. She doesn't want to marry Hizdahr, but it seems like the only action she can do. She sets aside her own personal wants and does what she thinks is best for the city, because if Hizdahr is able to give her peace, then that's something that she has to do to try and save her people. So I really like this chapter from Daenerys, even though I don't think it's like anything crazy. I think it really puts to the test how Daenerys is failing in her rulership and how she is as a person. She wants to help people, but she doesn't really know how to do that. She doesn't know how to rule. And so she thinks that the way that she can rule will be with getting Hizdahr, right? Appeasing people to then bring everyone together. And that gets us to number 32, Mel. So this chapter to me is probably the biggest shock to me. I remember reading A Dance with Dragons for the first time and seeing this chapter, and this chapter really is weird to me because you never would have thought George would have given Mel a chapter, because she's kind of like a mysterious type of character who has a lot of information that we, the audience, don't know. So like, for instance, it would be weird if we ever got like a Varys or Littlefinger chapter, because you would have basically all their plans in their head, and so how would you even do that? And so George kind of navigates that with Mel, and a chapter that I could have seen going very wrong for him actually goes quite right. I think this is a chapter that has a lot of different functions for George. One, George, I think, wanted to explore the magic of R'hllor and the Red God more, but how is he going to do that? There's not a lot of characters that are able to get kind of close to that and finding more out about the Red God. And we see a little bit of it happen in two different storylines in this book, one with kind of Tyrion and Victarion with Maquaro, and then also here with Mel. And this chapter also serves another function, because if you think about it, right, the wall right now has two POVs, right? It has Jon and Mel. But the thing is, by the end of this book, Jon is going to die. And so if you're George and you are going to have Jon come back, and even if you aren't, you have to have some other POV take over the wall, right, as our eyes into what's occurring there. And so it actually makes a lot of sense that he makes Mel a POV here, because he's going to need her to basically carry the wall plot until Jon gets back. But again, I really do like this chapter. It shows us how difficult Mel's magic is to her and how it's giving her pain and being harmful to do sometimes, but she makes it look easy, something that we've thought about the entire series. Like, how does Mel's magic work? It seems very, easy for her to do, but it's not. And a lot of her stuff is, sometimes it's interpretation with her visions, and other stuff it's just tricks. So we see kind of what Mel is doing and how she's able to play this role of this powerful but yet scary sorcerer or priestess that Mel is. We see her looking for visions as she seems to see Hardhome, maybe dragons, and the Eyeless Rangers again, Alice Karstark, who she believes is Arya, and she sees Jon's danger. And that's the biggest thing here, right, is that Jon is basically being surrounded by death. It seems to be coming for him, but Jon won't listen to Mel. And that is supposed to be our warning to his death, kind of like all the subtle ways George, say, foreshadowed the Red Wedding. We see her even doing a kindness for Davos, keeping his son actually close to her so that he wouldn't have to go off to march in war in this horrible thing that Stannis is dealing with right now that we'll see in the next Asha chapter, probably in the next part of the series, with them in this blizzard and this storm and people dying because of the cold or from starvation, all these different things. She has saved him from that, even though Davos' son probably won't thank her for it. But it's also going to be a big reveal is that Rattleshirt is not actually Rattleshirt, and he's actually Mance Rayder. Now, we don't get that to the very end of the chapter, but it's important because she basically calls for Rattleshirt to basically discuss some things about Arya, and she hears the horn. And it's, once again, like she sees in the visions and like what she saw, and like what she told Jon, that these three eyeless, Rangers come back to them, right, on. and their heads basically on spikes. And so it's Mel now having an in with Jon because her visions now are true. If you're Jon, you can't question it, right? She's predicted something that is pretty unpredictable. And so Jon is now forced to listen to Mel. And the two go to talk in her quarters when it's revealed. Mel basically, again, trying to gain Jon's trust because she's like, hey, let me send Rattleshirt to go help, Arya because my visions are real. You now believe that, Jon. And Jon, of course, he's not going to trust Rattleshirt. And that's when the Mance reveal happens. And this is a huge reveal because it kind of proves something else. If Mel believes, right, that it's King's blood that matters, right, why does she burn Rattleshirt instead of Mance? Mance is a king. Rattleshirt is not. And so I think that's very fascinating. It tells us more that it doesn't really have anything to do with King's blood. It has something to do with actually blood. Blood sacrifices and those types of things. But it also makes us question, if this is the case, why does Mel believe Stannis is Azor Ahai? She knows Lightbringer is not the true Lightbringer. It doesn't produce heat like Aemon said. And she also does these trickery things to basically fool people. Why does she believe in Stannis, right? That's the one thing I think is fascinating about this chapter, but basically the end of it is just she gains Jon's trust to send Mance and some spearwives to go save Arya. But I think the thing that's even more interesting is when you see that Mance actually does arrive for Arya's wedding, it kind of disproves the vision that Mel believes she's having. Because Arya, why would she be fleeing on a horse if she's already at this wedding and already Mance is there and all of those things? It kind of makes that vision not be true. But Mel doesn't know that. Again, it's hard to interpret these things. We know it's actually ended up being Alice Karstark. But that'll get us to chapter 33. And that gets us to Theon III. So Theon III to me is weird because of all the POVs, Theon is the one that I think every single chapter he just gets better. Each chapter that goes by improves and is more interesting than the last. And Theon III is no different. As we see Ramsay and his boys coming back to Barrowtown, who went out searching for the missing Freys that were with Wyman, and it seems very suspicious, right? Of course, the Freys are the ones that go missing, and Wyron Manderly would have a lot of issues with the Freys. But Theon is scared because Ramsay didn't find the Freys, and that would mean he failed his hunt. He would want to hurt someone, and Theon knows more than likely that will be him. Now, Theon does realize that Ramsay has to be a little bit more discreet because they are in Barrowtown. They can't be flaunting his cruelty and things like that. But still, Theon is a bit on edge and scared. We even see that Ramsay killed a man just for calling him a Snow. It shows you how insecure Ramsay is and petty and how cruel he is. But that leads us to a feast that is held. As Theon doesn't get any of the perks of being at this feast, he's chained to a wall to watch, basically, and getting any types of maybe scraps like a dog, or maybe even less than a dog. Theon must watch all of the festivities, but this is all interrupted when Roose Bolton comes into the hall. And Roose and Ramsay, I think their discussion is fascinating. Because it's really Roose telling Ramsay how fragile their rule over the North truly is. Most of the North hates them. Again, they betrayed Robb Stark, the king that they all seemed to like. And not only that, but Ramsay's actual character is not very liked either. He's already been shown to be a horrible person. There's been all these rumors about him, and the way he holds himself is also not great. And the way Ramsay is kind of using only fear, right? He's not understanding how you balance those things, and Roose is basically putting Ramsay into his place this whole time. And I find it so interesting because up to this point, we've kind of only seen Ramsay being fully free to do whatever he wants, right? That's kind of what Theon worries so much about. But here's somebody else that checks Ramsay's power, and it's something that could maybe lead to Ramsay killing Roose or Roose killing Ramsay. It's very interesting to think who is going to win out because it's kind of gone back and forth. But they also speak about how Stannis is also coming to try and get rid of their claim because of what they've done. And Stannis is gaining support, not losing it. At this time, Stannis looks really good. He seems to have about 5,000 men, with more men supposed to meet him basically when they go to Winterfell. So So Roos's position is not looking great. But then something else shockingly happens. Theon, who's just been allowed to watch this whole conversation, is actually wanted for. Now, Ramsay basically threatens Theon to not say anything and all those things, and basically be a spy. And Roose knows those things. Roose is not stupid. Roose seems to be nice to Theon, which is quite weird, right? He talks to Theon as if he actually cares, if he wants new clothes or things like that, and he kind of apologizes for Ramsay's behavior. It doesn't seem right. This isn't the character of Roose Bolton that we know. And Theon himself kind of thinks already that this is a trap. Roose is using him for something, but he just doesn't know what that is yet. And Theon's 100% right. Roose is trying to get Theon to play a role, to play Theon again, to give away Arya at Ramsay's wedding, because that's going to give Arya a lot of legitimacy. If Theon, somebody that knew her really well, is saying publicly, or basically being shown as publicly accepting that this is Arya Stark, it gives the Boltons a lot of legitimacy, and that's the game that Roose is playing. But Roose even goes further, talking about the backstory of not only the first Reek, but also Ramsay himself. And so we get some of the great conversation between, it's mainly Roose talking to Theon, but that some of that back and forth is very fascinating. And when you get to the final part of this, where Barbary Dustin, sees Theon, because they were basically going to, see her, she is like shocked at him, right? He seems to be gone half mad, and he doesn't look like Theon at all, right? People that used to know Theon wouldn't even think that this is Theon. Think about Theon 1, or I guess, Reek 1, but I'm just going to call it Theon. They don't even recognize him in that chapter. And that's kind of what we see. It's Theon being groomed into a role to give away Arya to Ramsay, and that psychological damage that's been placed there by Ramsay upon Theon. Really great chapter. And again, I think he only improves through pretty much each and every chapter. And that gets us into chapter 34. Chapter 34, which is Tyrion VIII, to me, is a chapter where not much happens. That's basically the way I'll sum it up. It's like a repeat of like Tyrion with young Griff, where they're on the boat pretty much the entire chapter. But at least in that chapter, right, you had interesting things going on. Tyrion trying to figure out who all these people are and their interesting backstories and some of the conversation with those characters. Well, here, that's just not the case. There's really a very few amount of people that even speak the common speech on this boat that they're on. And of those people, none of them are truly interesting outside of Moquaro. And so this chapter follows basically two or three things. One, Tyrion's relationship with Penny, right? And trying to, be friendly with her and make her feel better, because they basically took Penny along with them on this little boat trip. And that really, to me, I don't really like Penny and Tyrion's dynamic in this book. It's just, to me, a lot of fluff. There's not a ton of substance there. It's, one of those things where it's like, oh, Tyrion tries to speak to Penny. Penny runs away. They speak again a little bit later, and they become kind of friends. And it's like, I just don't really care that much about it. Now, the interesting part of this chapter is the Moquaro stuff. Learning more about, about R'hllor and, the visions that he's seeing. And he even has this very cryptic line that seems to be about Euron, which I do find quite fascinating. And again, I think of really the next two chapters, this one and his next one, the only interesting part about the chapter is the Moquaro stuff. And even that, Moquaro is going to go to Victarion's plot. There's just not a lot going on for Tyrion. Unfortunately, I don't find much interesting with the character. I think his chapters are just not needed. Like, I almost think that you could have just gone from after Tyrion 6, you just basically quickly retell this stuff, because again, like I've kind of reviewed for these chapters with Tyrion, there's not much really to say. They get on a boat. They stay on the boat for a while. Tyrion talks to Moquaro and Penny, and that's it. Like, that's it. It seems like, why didn't we just pick up with, like, maybe Tyrion already in slavery or whatever? Like, we just don't need this chapter and the next chapter. Like, we almost didn't even need 3 of Tyrion's chapters. Like, the 3 chapters between the young Griff stuff and then also becoming a slave or being sold into slavery. That stuff, like, in between just doesn't do anything. It doesn't really particularly matter. But that'll get us into chapter 35. So again, like I talk about, Tyrion's chapter, which again is not a very good one in my opinion. It's very much in the bottom like 5 chapters so far of the book. It's placed between a really good Theon chapter and placed between a really good Bran chapter. Again, I just think George knows those things when he has weaker and really good chapters. So this is the end of Bran's actual journey within the story that we have right now. Until Winds of Winter comes out, this is the last chapter we have of Bran. And it basically fulfills, in my opinion, all of Bran's arc up to now, right? It's him finally awakening his powers and becoming somewhat of either the Three-Eyed Crow's apprentice or possibly maybe the Three-Eyed Crow in the future or whatever you want to say, right? But I never thought I'd ever say this in a book, but Bran is significantly better than Tyrion. This chapter is fascinating, right? As Tyrion is, warging into Hodor and forcing his will upon Hodor. He's in summer and he's exploring these caves and the deep places of the children of the forest and learning a bit more about them. But at the same time, even though they've escaped, the perils of their journey, Jojen seems to be becoming sadder and sadder. It seems like he knows something about his fate is to come. And I've kind of talked about a lot of the hints. I've done multiple Jojen paced videos. I think the best one I've probably done was last year when we did the 25 Winds of Winter theories, or some of the more popular theories. I think it's pretty set in stone that Jojen became Jojen paste, this blood paste that Bran is forced to consume, more or less. And I really do think it's more like a blood sacrifice with the power and the blood of Jojen awakens Bran's basically his third eye, more or less, and becomes, of someone be able to see. As Bran drinks this blood paste, it begins to show him visions, and he sees a bunch of things through the Godswood and the tree that we talk about. I even reference this in my reread of Game of Thrones with Catelyn's first chapter, where she thinks that the tree, the heart tree, is basically following her. Its eyes seem to be watching her. That seems apparent here with Bran, because Bran sees a number of things. He sees a vision of Ned, it seems like right after Robert's Rebellion, talking about how, Jon and Robin helping them to grow up as like brothers and things like that. We also see, again, we don't know confirmed who these people are, but in the vision it seems like we see Lyanna and Benjen playing at the pool. We see some other stuff, right? There's some other stuff, like a pregnant woman coming out of the pool, past Starks, which I think is really interesting. But it goes to show that Bran is connected to a place of home, of, his interests and his emotion. And Bloodraven sees that right away because he himself is drawn to his past. And he gives one of the most famous lines of this book, and, trying to speculate on, him as a character during the first Blackfire Rebellion. He talks about how he had a brother he loved, a brother he hated, and a woman he desired. 2 of these are quite obvious, as it's Shiera Seastar and Aegor in terms of the brother he hated and the woman he desired. But the brother he loved is left up to interpretation. I personally really subscribe to the theory that that is actually Daemon Blackfire. That's the person he loved. But this could also be Daeron, of course. But to me, I think it'd be really cool if it was actually Daemon Blackfire. But at this point, the story kind of ends for Bran. He doesn't get another chapter in this book, which I think is a shame. I know why, though. I think George is going for this kind of similar to Arya and Sansa route of the character just needs to have a lot of time off screen to be developing and learning. And so that when we come back to the character in Winds of Winter, he's probably going to be a very changed character. Not to say he's going to be like a robot like he was in the show, but he might not be as maybe human, or might not be as much of Bran as he used to be because of these visions and all these things he's seeing and the knowledge that he may now know. But that gets us to chapter 36, Jon VII. And I do want to say, Bran, this is probably his best book. Even though this is the book that he's in with the least amount of chapters, I think he's really good in this book. And I wish we got a little bit more of him. I wish we got like 1 or 2 more chapters, but we'll have to wait until Winds of Winter. So getting into Jon VII, again, this is just another one of those chapters that it's just in the middle of Jon's arc. It's building things to come for later on. Not much really happens. It's Jon going ranging with some new recruits who are going to say their vows with the old gods. It's the same thing that Jon and Sam do in book 1, but it seems a bit more risky now, right? You just had this wildling attack on the wall. The others are becoming more and more prominent. It seems a very dangerous mission to say some vows. But Jon, rightly so, says, these men are swearing their lives to the wall. I will go with them, right? It's a very important thing for them to see me there. And I think that's a really good moment from Jon. But outside of that, there isn't much happening, right? You have one thing where Jon is trying to reopen some of the castles, and he's going to have one where it's basically all females. That's going to be all the spear wives and things. That's going to be led by Iron Emmett and Dolorous Edd, which to me is another kind of mistake. I know why he's doing it, because he needs men he can trust to overlook the new castles, and especially with a castle full of women. But at the same time, he's taking, in my opinion, two of his last real loyal supporters and doing away with them, right? So that he is slowly isolating himself even more. But upon arrival, they find a group of wildlings and a giant, and they actually end up surrounding them just in case, they're going to have to attack them. But we have this weird moment of peace. These wildlings and this giant, they're basically dying. They have no food left. They have no hope of getting, south of the wall. They won't be able to make it to Hardhome. They're dying. And so Jon, after hearing these vows, decides that he should help these wildlings as well. They are men. They are human. They should defend them as well. And they basically are deciding to let them come with them through the wall. But not only does he allow wildlings through the wall, he also brings two of the bodies of the wildlings with them. He wants to study them to see if the others are able to come back or not and what that means. But the problem I once again have with Jon, and this has been a prominent theme throughout the entire story for Jon, is he just doesn't communicate things well. And don't get me wrong, he is the Lord Commander. He doesn't have to tell everybody everything. But when you're bringing two dead bodies south of from north of the wall to the south, it's a little weird. And he doesn't really explain that to the people. Maybe he explains that to Bowen Marsh or whatever. But if you're an average Night's Watchman and you're seeing this and you're going, where we brought back some wildlings and a giant, people that we've been against and fought against forever, and you're bringing back two dead bodies. It's just a weird look for Jon, and he doesn't help himself. And that's what it's so frustrating to read Jon sometimes, because he does not express why he does things. And so you're leaving it up to, rumors and what people think Jon may be thinking, and that's what a lot, I think, leads to his death. But that is not exactly the end of it either, as he hears news of Stannis' conquest, as his army is growing. But he wonders if Winterfell is a trap for Stannis, which it is, right? We know that is the case. It is a trap, because the Boltons are going to get to go to a defensible position. They're going to have more food and ration than Stannis. Stannis will have to siege them and be outside of the wall. And we also know that he is going to be betrayed by the Karstark coming here as well. So yes, Jon is quite right. And also Arya isn't the real Arya, but that doesn't matter to Stannis. He doesn't know that information. And the mountain clans that he has with him, they are going to want to save Arya. And that's going to force Stannis' hand. He has to go to Winterfell. He can't just allow this marriage and all this stuff to actually happen. But that gets us to chapter 37, Dany 6. I really like the opening of this chapter, but I don't like the end. And so we'll talk about it. There's two parts of this chapter, and it's weird to me because it's the main two, I think, conflicting forces of why I like and don't like Daenerys in this book. Because part of it is the side of her trying to rule, right? It's her trying to save people, but she doesn't know how to do that. And so it's her inspecting, the refugees and the horror that this war has created. People are left dying outside of Meereen, these Astapor refugees. They're, going without food and supplies, and people are too afraid to even, go near them. And so they're just left to die, really. It reminds me a lot of one of the Daenerys chapters in a Game of Thrones. I believe it's Daenerys VII, if I'm not mistaken, where she's basically seeing all these people being, sexually abused and killed by the Dothraki. And that's kind of the same idea here. It's just, it's not because of people actually harming them. It's because this shortage of food. It's because of, this disease that has been created because of war. And it's George really hammering into us that war, this is what it does to people. And it's Daenerys trying to do her best, right? It's her trying to give these people comfort, whether it's just, blessing them or trying to clean them or, care for them, trying to show that she cares, because that's the only thing that she can do for them, right? Her men are too afraid to bring them food and all of those things. So all she can really do is try to give them attention, right? She's helpless to their pleas for help. She can do really nothing. And so that's the part of the chapter I really do enjoy. I love putting Daenerys in these situations where she doesn't know what she can do. She feels hopeless. She feels backed into a corner. That's going to lead to some interesting, conflicts. The part of the chapter I'm not a huge fan of is the part where it's Daenerys discussing like marriage traditions with Hizdahr, and they're at dinner kind of talking about some of those things. I don't really like that part of her story much. I don't really like Daenerys's kind of romance arcs in this, with whether that's with Quentyn, whether it's with Daario, whether it's with Hizdahr. It's just not my favorite thing for Daenerys. And that really comes up, after this as well, because not only do we get kind of the marriage stuff going on, but after the marriage stuff, Daario arrives telling her of how things are going, right? Yunkai is marching on Meereen. But not only that, to Daenerys' heartbreak, Brown Ben Plum with the Second Sons have actually switched sides. And it's so heartbreaking because Daenerys really liked him, and that becomes very apparent. She thinks about him during like their council meetings, that she really does enjoy him, and to see him flip on her. And it seems to be because she's not using her dragons. Her case is looking worse and worse. She's not leaning into being a Targaryen. And so I really like that Daenerys is facing consequences for some of the things that she's done and for not listening to counsel. But the chapter ends with her basically having sex with Daario, which is always not my favorite stuff. But yeah, I think a solid Daenerys chapter overall. But for me, like, Dany VI is the most, I don't know, how would I say this? The most Daenerys chapter of this book. It has its good things, and it also has its bad things, unfortunately. But that'll get us into number 38, which is thankfully another Theon chapter. So Theon IV, to me, is a very controversial chapter to me. I'm not even sure how this chapter is viewed by most of the A Song of Ice and Fire community, because it's definitely one of the darkest chapters in A Song of Ice and Fire. This chapter is Jane Poole and Ramsay's wedding. So you already know where this chapter is kind of going, but I won't lie. This is definitely one of my favorite chapters, and it's weird to me that I say that because of such a controversial ending to the chapter and how horrifying that is. But at the same time, I'm a big Maester conspiracy fan, and I love Barbary Dustin's speech on the Maesters, and I'm right there with you, sis. I agree. Those Maesters are sus as hell. But let me, chronologically break down this chapter a little bit for you guys. Just a lot of things that come to mind about the chapter that I really do enjoy. So the first thing I enjoy about this is establishing that relationship between Jane Poole and Theon. Her basically pleading Theon for help and all of these things, and Theon, who is trying to help her by telling her to be Arya, right? Don't give him a reason to hurt you. It's literally Theon who's been abused by this person for a long time now. It really shows to us kind of how that abuse has worked and psychologically broken Theon. But it's also a very haunting chapter as well. This is Theon's first chapter back in Winterfell. And so it's a very dark chapter in terms of what it represents to Theon. So Theon not only has to go back into kind of playing the role of Theon, which is already very uncomfortable for him, he has to give away Jane Poole. It's basically him giving her away to be abused and tortured the way Theon has been. And it's just him struggling through that, struggling through this mentally, struggling through it physically as he tries to make sure he walks straight and doesn't fall or any of those things because of, his toes being taken or whatnot. It's an incredibly dark chapter. But even more so, after the wedding happens, because it happens, outside, Theon hears his name. It seems to be calling for him, trying to awaken him as being Theon and breaking him out of this Greek persona. It seems to be, in my opinion, Bran speaking to him from the Godswood, which is very interesting, telling us that maybe, what Brynden Rivers tells Bran, that he can't change the past, maybe not true. Bran may be more powerful than Brynden Rivers ever was, because he definitely seems to reach out to Theon. Or maybe Theon's imagining it, but either way, It's Theon slowly breaking out of this Reek character that he's playing as, that he's been trained to play as. But we get to the feast, and this is where I think the chapter really gets interesting, because on one hand, you have the Frey pie theory that is prevalent here, where Wyman Manderley is very excited about these pies and having a lot of servings of pie. And so I really enjoy that part of it. It seems like that Frey pie is happening, but I really enjoy the conversation that Barbary has with Theon, where she's telling him a lot about her past and her relationship with Brandon Stark, and the reason Rickard Stark even went south, and trying to get these alliances with the South. It's really interesting to see the way this character was made through those things, and some of the things happening before Robert's Rebellion. It's very interesting to see those things, and I love all of that. I love the Maester stuff. And then we get to probably one of the most horrifying things of this chapter. As soon as we read that Theon is called by Ramsay, you can tell where this is going right away. Because Theon is forced to, let's just say, get Arya ready for her husband on their bedding ceremony. Let's just put it that way. And it's incredibly difficult to read. It's incredibly difficult. Theon having to get Jane ready for Ramsay, it's just psychological torture. It's telling Theon that you can't do anything. Theon even has a knife. He could try to attack Ramsay, but he doesn't. It's just that breaking. It's slowly Theon being broken down. It's slowly Theon realizing he needs to become Theon again. And so I really like the chapter. I think it's incredibly dark. I know it's a controversial chapter of this series, but I do have, I do really like the chapter overall for what it does for the story. And that gets us to number 39, Areo Hotah. And I mentioned this earlier on in the video, but this is the one and only Dornish chapter we get. There's no Arion chapters in this book. And so this is kind of our update chapter, right? Just to kind of tell us what's going on in Dorne to get us ready for Winds of Winter. And so we see Areo Hotah at the first half of this chapter is all about this kind of feast that's taking place, where Balon Swan has finally arrived to Sunspear, and now what's going to happen, right? Balon Swan was sent to get back Myrcella and all of that. But where is Myrcella? And how is Doran going to spin this tale of what occurred with Arion's coup that was trying to put Myrcella on the throne? What is going to happen there? What is Doran going to tell Balon Swan in terms of Eris Oakheart's death and Myrcella's kind of missing ear? What is he going to tell him? And so the whole thing plays out as kind of just a performance from Doran. Even allegedly Gregor's head has been delivered, which is complete and utter BS, right? That's just not Gregor's head. And the first half of this is just full of tension. I really like that part of this chapter. It's full of tension. The Dornish, even when there's like a toast for Tommen, half the Dornish seem to not even toast at all. It shows how Dorne is on the brink of war. But the second half talks about the real Dornish plan and what Doran has planned. He is going to basically get Balon Swan to go after Darkstars. Myrcella will be fed kind of a lie about what truly happened. And Doran is going to set out getting the Sand Snakes in positions of power or influence, or trying to basically make them spies. He's going to send Obara to assist with Darkstar's capture because he's somebody that knows what would have happened, and you want him dead more or less. He wants Nymeria to take Oberyn's seat on the council, and Tyene needs to get close to the High Septon. He wants the Sand Snakes in a position to bite if needed be, like a snake. And he also reveals the plot that was set before him. That what was really supposed to happen was when Trystane and Myrcella were going to be on their way back to King's Landing, they were going to be attacked by a group of basically mercenaries that was going to be shouting basically half man or the imp that were going to more or less make Doran not think it was Cersei that did it, as they were going to have Trystane killed, blaming Tyrion. And so you see how Doran is very smart. He's understanding what the circumstances are, and he's changing the field. And so I really like that part of it. Now, the other part of this chapter I really like as well is actually Illyrius and how she doesn't want any of this war and violence to happen anymore. She doesn't want killing. She doesn't want all these things. She's very smart. But yeah, but this chapter is a very good chapter of setting up the Dornish plot to go forward. But I think my only problem with this chapter is just Areo Hotah is not a very interesting POV. Since we're in his head, I mean, he just kind of stands there and watches everything. He doesn't really have too much of an actual personality. He's very much a passive POV character, which isn't necessarily a bad thing all the time, but it's when you have a character that doesn't have much enjoyment value. Like, he doesn't have, like, for instance, say, like Tyrion in the first 3 books where, in being inside of his head, he thinks very interesting thoughts and he's a very interesting character. Areo Hotah is kind of one note. But still a great chapter, and that'll move us into 40th chapter, Jon VIII. Now, Jon VIII is not exactly a long chapter. It's actually quite short, but in my opinion, it is a pivotal chapter into the second half of Jon's story. Because on one hand, he's making a huge risk of sending Val to Tormund to try and get him to basically treat with him and to basically create a peace in which the wildlings can come south of the wall. This is a massive move, right? Because the wildlings that came through the wall before, not the ones like in the last chapter I talked about with Jon, that little small party that came through, the last time the wildlings were allowed to come south was because Stannis allowed that to happen and all of those things. This is completely different, right? This is having thousands of wildlings come through the wall willingly by Jon. It is very threatening. Because if you think about the wildlings and the Night's Watch have been enemies for years, right? And you're going to now allow them to go through the wall, your only defense against the wildlings. Well, what if the wildlings turn on you, right? What if they remember all these people that they have lost because of the Night's Watch? What stops them from rallying up and killing all of them, right? They don't have enough men to, man the walls. And the counter to that is obviously, well, the other's threat, right? It's at least they're human, right? You can negotiate with them. And so it's one of these weird things because Jon is getting rid of Val, who is Stannis' prize. Stannis would not want her to be released. And it's also, you're doing something that is heavily against the Night's Watch. And again, Jon doesn't take any type of counsel. He doesn't listen to anybody. He just acts. He does this thing with Val without getting any counsel from anybody else, seeing what they think about this. And so it comes off as Jon going against the Night's Watch and doing things just recklessly. And that's the big part of this, because the second half of the chapter is going to be people voicing their complaints, right? Led by kind of Bowen Marsh. Because Jon has been doing some things that are quite weird. Because from their point of view, who Jon is not really having any counsel with anybody, he's just making decisions on his own, people don't understand what he's doing. He just doesn't explain it. And so the reason he dies is really built upon this chapter, in my opinion. Because not only is he going to be, pissing off Stannis and his men, he's also going to be pissing off the Night's Watch as well. And so he has no backing, really, on any of the decisions he's making. He just does them. And so Bowen Marsh and the others talk about how Leathers has been made a master of arms, but he's a wildling, and how Satine has become basically what Jon used to be for Jeor Mormont. And that's meant to be, grooming him for rule. Well, that's not how that's supposed to work. Satine is very lowborn, right? He is someone that has a very troubled past. Why is he being groomed for rule, right? It's this hierarchy, and they just don't understand Jon's motivations. They don't understand why Jon is doing things, and Jon doesn't bother explaining it to them. But then they also argue about sending Val and to negotiate with Tormund at all, as well as these dead bodies Jon has brought back and said nothing about. And Jon, I think, in my opinion, is completely wrong in the way he handles this conversation. What these people want, they're not being antagonistic to Jon. They're questioning him. They want to know why he's doing the things he does, because he doesn't ask anybody for counsel. He acts alone. And yes, you can do those things, right? A king or a Lord Commander has that power. But what does it do? It isolates the people around you, especially when it's controversial things, right? Think about Aegon V. He's a king that is definitely a good person at heart. But a lot of the things that he does goes against his council. It goes against the people that are the wealthy and the highborn. And it puts a massive target on Aegon's back to where he's not able to ever really keep these things enforced because he just does things that a lot of people don't like. He doesn't make people understand why these things need to happen. And it's a bit different. I think Aegon V is way more justified than Jon is here, but Jon should be telling them a lot more. He just basically yells at them and just kind of like shuts the conversation down. There's no real discussion on ideology or thoughts in a meaningful way. It's Jon being very youthful and very egotistical, right? I am somebody when I was younger, I relate to Jon a lot in this. I was somebody that didn't know exactly how to converse with people when they have different conflicting views than your own, right? How do you deal with those kind of conversations? And Jon kind of reminds me of myself, right? Where I wasn't able to do those things. And, you know, I've learned, I think, a lot from that. And so for an example, right? I don't believe in, you know, certain things like smoking, right? Because of maybe health, you know, or whatever. But I still have friends that maybe do those things. But it's not like I hate them or anything like that. Like, that's what they want to do with their life, and that's what they want to do. So who am I to judge them for those things? That's kind of how I view, like, Jon right now. He's not doing that, though. Jon is somebody that is very much doing my way or the highway type philosophy, and he's not even explaining why he got onto his highway of thought. And so I think Jon is not the greatest Lord Commander because he doesn't know how to explain things. He's not very good at communication. But I really brought a lot of attention to this chapter, and I went on a little bit more of a tangent with this one because this is a pivotal chapter. It is a chapter that condemns Jon's fate because it's one, setting up the plot line for Tormund to come south of the wall and all the wildlings, the thing that basically nails it in the coffin that Jon is going to be killed. He's isolating the people that gave him power. So something I talked about on Tuesday's video with Catelyn in her first chapter of the Clash of Kings, she kind of gives Robb the same advice that like Jon's doing right now. Even if the people around you don't like what you're doing, you're still the king. They can't unmake you. And something that Robb responds with, which is very wise, is that the same people that make you a king can unmake you a king. That's the same thing that applies here to Jon. So I really like the writing that George does for this chapter because it needs to work. This is the flip chapter. But the 41st chapter is unfortunately Tyrion's. We're going to end on kind of a note. But we see that we pick up with Tyrion and Penny back still on this ship, and they're doing this joust thing. I guess it shows, again, Tyrion has put his pride aside and things like that. He's, I guess, growing as a character, even though it's still kind of But we see that they've lost the wind, right? That it's actually being very difficult to move their ship and things like that. And they think that they've won the day as they realize, you know, the wind is picking up, but instead it's a storm. And Moqorro gives a very cryptic line, like, this is why the ship will not reach its destination is because of this storm. And so it really is interesting because Moqorro is the most interesting part of his 3 chapters on this boat. Moqorro is like the only thing interesting, really, in my opinion, of the 3 chapters that we've talked about in today's video. And so he kind of already knows what his fate seems like it's going to be. One of the things that Melisandre always sees first in her visions that she's basically trained herself to do is to look for things that threaten herself. And so it's interesting because I think Moqorro already realizes what his fate is to be with Victarion. But either way, they have this storm, and in the middle of this storm, Penny and Tyrion kiss, but it's not like a romantic kiss, or that's what they both say anyway. It's like, okay, you know, I don't really buy this relationship that much, and I don't really care about it that much, but okay. But eventually, their boat is basically destroyed. It's damaged beyond repairs. They are basically sitting ducks until they either starve out or die, more or less. And so for 19 days, they wait. And during this time, actually during the storm, I should say, some of the men were basically thrown overboard, Moqorro being one of those people. They are presumed dead by Tyrion and us, the audience, but that is not the case, as we'll know a little later on. But they eventually see a boat. And this seems like a good thing, right? They can maybe be picked up from being stranded, but Jorah sourly notes it is a slave ship. So, yeah, I think we end part 3 in kind of a more of a whimper than a big moment like we did with, I'd say, part 2. But that's just the case. Tyrion is kind of down there with like Quentyn right now for me, where anytime I see a Quentyn or a Tyrion chapter, I know it's not really going to be a good one. And that's just the case, right? It's unfortunate, but that's the problems of A Dance with Dragons. A Dance with Dragons has super huge highs like the Davos chapter or the Theon chapters or some of Jon and Daenerys' chapters. But then you have the really big lows. And that's kind of this chapter, the Tyrion's arc, Quentin's arc, stuff like that. So, yeah, I hope you guys have all enjoyed part 3. I know a lot of you guys were wanting me to continue this series, and I always was going to. It just when I got the time and the motivation to get back to this series. And, as if you're at the end of this video, consider subscribing and liking. These videos take a lot more time than most of the stuff on my channel outside of maybe the rereads. But, yeah, it should be a nice long video for you guys. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.